The sound of rain against a window has always been a comfort to some people, a steady rhythm that shields them from the silence of the night. Yet in certain houses that same rhythm carries a darker weight. It becomes a veil, a cover under which other sounds can hide, soft footsteps on wood, a creak in the hallway, a whisper of something shifting in a room thought to be empty. Loneliness is supposed to mean safety, a guarantee that no one else is there. But what if being alone is only an illusion, and the silence is shared with something unseen? There are stories passed down in fragments, told with unease in dimly lit kitchens and at family gatherings where older relatives hesitate before speaking. Stories of nights where the walls of a home seemed to breathe, where people swore they felt watched though no figure appeared in the window. In these accounts, isolation was not peace. It was the stage for something patient, something that required the stillness of solitude in order to move closer. This story begins with one such night. A storm had swept across the valley, leaving streets dark, lined with heavy shadows where streetlights had long since flickered out. At the edge of town stood a house that many avoided speaking of directly, though they never admitted why. Its design was ordinary, a two-story structure with a steep roof and a narrow porch, yet there was something about it that unsettled the neighbors. They claimed the house never looked alive. The curtains stayed drawn even when lights burned faintly inside. No one could recall seeing laughter spill from its windows, or the warmth of voices echo from its walls. It was as if the place itself breathed loneliness. Inside, the rooms were quiet, too quiet for comfort. The sound of the storm pressed heavily against the glass, each drop like a finger tapping insistently, as if asking to be let in. A single lamp flickered in the corner of the living room, casting uneven shadows that stretched across the walls like figures frozen in motion. The floor creaked with every shift of weight, though no one moved across it. There was a sense of waiting, a heaviness in the air that made every breath feel restrained. The story tells of a figure who sat alone in that house, staring at the rain through the window. They had chosen to stay behind when others left town, perhaps for work, perhaps for reasons never made clear. What mattered was the isolation. It had been days since they had spoken to another person, and in that silence the mind begins to betray its host. Every flicker of shadow becomes a shape. Every groan of the house becomes a warning. Yet sometimes the mind does not need to invent what is already there. The first sign was simple. A sound upstairs heavy enough to suggest weight, light enough to be dismissed. The person froze, their ears straining against the constant hiss of rain, waiting for it to repeat. Nothing came. They told themselves it was the house settling, the roof responding to the storm. But the thought lingered. The upstairs door had been closed and the sound came from beyond it. They rose slowly, their hand brushing against the lamp as if touching it would somehow anchor them. The stairs loomed in the dim light, each step a test of courage against the silence above. Yet they did not climb. They stayed rooted at the base, heart pounding, the echo of that single sound repeating endlessly in their memory. And then the silence broke again, not from above but from behind. A dull scrape like fingernails trailing against wood drifted from the back door. It was not the wind. It was not the rain. It was deliberate, slow, and patient. The person turned, their breath caught, the faint glow of the lamp bending shadows into grotesque shapes along the walls. They strained their eyes toward the kitchen where the door stood, half seen in darkness. There was no figure, only the suggestion of movement, as if the night itself had leaned in close to listen. They did not move closer. They did not dare. The air pressed in heavy around them, carrying the unmistakable knowledge that they were no longer alone, though no face stared back. They remembered the stories whispered years ago, of people who once stayed in this house and claimed to hear the same scraping sounds, the same creaks of hidden weight above their heads. Few had spoken about what followed, but their silences carried more weight than their words ever could. Rain thickened against the windows, but the sound beneath it carried through, the scrape now longer, more insistent. It was not a knock. It was not a demand. It was a reminder, steady and cruel, that whatever was outside was patient. The person stepped backward, their body trembling, the wooden floor groaning under each reluctant movement. They could not explain why tears formed in their eyes or why their throat felt tight, but instinct whispered that they had already been marked. The storm raged. The shadows stretched, and the house, once thought to be a place of solitude, betrayed its secret. Being alone did not mean being safe. Sometimes being alone meant you were the only one left to notice that something had finally come inside. The story begins here, in that silence thick with dread, with only one question echoing louder than the storm outside. If the house was empty, then who or what was making those sounds? The town never spoke openly about the house on the hill, though it stood there for decades, weathering storms and seasons like any other structure. To an outsider, it was only timber, stone, and glass. But those who lived in its shadow whispered of its history in hushed tones, always glancing over their shoulders, as if the mere act of remembering was enough to summon something back. It had been built during a period of expansion, when the valley was alive with new families, businesses, and the promise of a future untouched by the struggles of the outside world. Streets had been lined with fresh paint, new churches, and hopeful faces. Yet the house on the hill was different even then. It was constructed not by a family seeking community, but by a man who valued separation. He had arrived from elsewhere carrying little more than money and silence. People recalled him as a figure who kept his eyes lowered, who purchased his land without negotiation, and who accepted no offers of friendship. Within a year, the house was complete, tall, dark-roofed, and strangely severe against the gentle backdrop of the valley. Neighbors attempted visits in the beginning. They carried baskets of food, brought their children to play, and asked the man to join church gatherings. He refused each time, speaking so little that some questioned if he was even capable of warmth. Soon the neighbors stopped trying. His windows remained shuttered, his porch empty, his property unwelcoming. The house grew into something else, not just a structure, but a boundary. It divided what was known from what was left unspoken. Over time, people claimed to notice things. Shadows in the windows when the man was thought to be away, the sound of music playing faintly on windless nights, a voice carrying across the fields when no one stood on the porch. It was easy, perhaps, to dismiss such things as imagination, yet even the strongest skeptics admitted the house held an air that pressed too heavy on the chest, as if stepping across its yard meant stepping into something not meant for the living. The man lived there until he was found lifeless in one of the upper rooms. No one had entered the house until that discovery. The details of his death were unclear, his body showing no wounds, no cause beyond the word natural. Yet those who had walked the halls to retrieve him claimed the air inside the home was wrong. It smelled of damp earth, though no leaks were found. The furniture seemed to have shifted slightly, out of line with the marks left in the floorboards. And in one upstairs room, the windows had been nailed shut from the inside, though no tools were ever recovered. After his death, the house passed hands multiple times. Families moved in, each hoping to claim it as their own, but few stayed long. They reported odd disturbances, doors that refused to stay closed, faint knocks in the night, the persistent feeling of being observed when alone in the kitchen or stairwell. A child once told her mother that a woman stood by her bed at night, whispering words she could not understand. The family fled within the week, leaving their belongings behind. Another tenant disappeared entirely, leaving no trace but an unfinished letter found on a nightstand, its ink blurred as if smudged by tears. The letter ended mid-sentence. As the years passed, the house shifted in reputation. Some called it cursed, others called it abandoned. Yet it was never truly empty. Even when the windows were dark, neighbors insisted they sometimes caught movement inside. Even when locked, the doors bore fresh scratches as though something from within had tried to leave. Children dared one another to touch the front steps, but none ever lingered. The silence around it was not born of indifference, it was fear wrapped in ritual. The silence of people who understood that acknowledging certain places invites them closer. The most unsettling detail, however, came from the few who attempted to document its history. A local archivist once noted that census records for the property were inconsistent. Some years listed more residents than could ever be verified. Other years, no one at all was recorded, even though neighbors swore they saw someone moving behind the curtains. One set of records suggested that the original man had not lived there alone, though no one in the town could recall ever seeing another person cross the threshold. The archivist died not long after releasing his findings, his notes scattered and incomplete. Some believed his death was coincidence. Others argued that even seeking answers about the house was an invitation to join its silence. By the time the present occupant arrived, the house had already absorbed decades of unease. It stood like a monument to solitude, its very walls saturated with stories that never reached completion. The decision to live there puzzled many, yet no one spoke against it. They had learned over time that the safest way to deal with the house was to pretend it did not exist. But inside, the truth waited. The new occupant, who thought solitude would be simple, had unknowingly walked into a space shaped by absence, molded by fear, and perhaps watched by something that had been waiting through every season of vacancy. And so the story of that night, the night of the storm, did not emerge from nowhere. It was a continuation of whispers that stretched back through decades, of footsteps that had already crossed the threshold long before. The house was not just a place to be alone. It was a place where being alone meant facing something that did not want to be forgotten. The storm that night had not been the first, but it was the first that felt different. The occupant, already burdened by long hours of silence, noticed how the walls of the house seemed to strain against the wind, as if the structure itself resisted something more than the weather. Rain streaked the windows in uneven trails, distorting the faint glow of the lamp into shapes that looked like faces pressed against the glass. He tried not to look too long, for the longer he stared, the clearer the impressions became, until he could swear that the glass bulged slightly, as though something breathed from the other side. The evening began as any other. He prepared a simple meal, the sound of cutlery clinking against the plate echoing too loudly in the quiet. He switched on the small radio in the corner, only to find static swallowing the channels. No voice, no music, only the endless hiss that grew louder the longer it stayed on. He turned it off quickly, but the silence that followed was worse. It carried weight, a presence that reminded him he was not only isolated from the town but also from everything familiar. The silence became alive, a canvas upon which every creak, every faint rustle of fabric, every vibration of the storm etched a message he could not decipher. It was late when the first true disturbance came. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. He paid little attention until the flicker repeated, pulsing in rhythm with the sound of his breath. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowed when he noticed something else, shadows shifting on the far wall. Not the shadows cast by the lamp, but taller, broader shapes that moved independently, gliding across the plaster in silence. He froze, waiting for the flicker to stop, waiting for the shadows to vanish. Instead, they remained even when the light steadied, stretching long fingers across the room before dissolving into the corners. He told himself the storm created the illusion, that trees swaying in the wind outside the window explained it. Yet when he stepped to the glass, he found the branches still. The shadows had no source. He lingered there too long, pressing his hand against the pane until another sound pulled him away. A sharp knock from the second floor. 3 distinct strikes like knuckles against wood echoing down the stairwell. The air left his lungs in a single unsteady gasp. He tried to rationalize, to remind himself that the house was old, that wood swelled in damp weather, that sounds traveled oddly in storms. But nothing could disguise the clarity of those knocks. They carried intention, each spaced evenly as though someone waited between them. The staircase stretched upward into darkness, its steps yawning like open mouths. He did not climb. He could not. Instead, he sat at the base of the stairs listening, straining his ears until the pulse in his temples grew louder than the storm itself. Minutes passed. Perhaps hours. The house offered nothing more. He eventually forced himself to return to the kitchen, but the quiet was now poisoned. Every corner threatened movement. Every reflection in the glass hinted at eyes that vanished the instant he turned. When he reached for a glass of water, his hand trembled, spilling droplets across the counter. That was when he noticed the trail. A thin line of moisture stretched across the wooden floor, beginning near the back door and winding toward the hall. It was not rainwater. The door had been locked, the frame sealed against the storm. Yet the trail gleamed faintly under the lamplight as though freshly laid. He crouched, his fingers hovering just above it before pulling back sharply. The liquid was not water. It carried a faint metallic sheen, thicker than rain, darker. It led toward the staircase. He refused to follow it. His chest tightened, his pulse thundering as his eyes darted between the base of the stairs and the back door. He tried to reason again, to tell himself it was nothing more than a leak, though no pipe existed along that wall. The thought of going upstairs gnawed at him, yet his body would not obey. He remained frozen, ears straining for another sound, another explanation. Instead, the house gave him something worse. The door to the upstairs room creaked open on its own. Slowly, steadily, the hinges groaned, filling the silence with a sound too deliberate to be explained away. His head snapped upward, eyes locking on the black gap forming at the top of the stairs. The door did not slam. It did not swing wide. It only opened enough to suggest something beyond, waiting in the dark. The air shifted, a draft descending the stairwell, colder than the storm outside. He stumbled backward, nearly knocking the lamp from its table, his breath quick and shallow. His thoughts raced. He could leave, run into the storm, abandon the house altogether. Yet the moment he reached for the front door, his hand hesitated. There was no safety out there. He felt it with a certainty that pierced deeper than logic. The storm did not want him. The town did not want him. Only the house did, and so he stayed, rooted in place, staring at the darkness above. Hours might have passed, or perhaps only moments. At some point, exhaustion overcame terror and his body gave in. He sat slumped in the chair, the lamp still burning, his eyes closing despite every instinct to keep them open. In the fragile haze of sleep he dreamed, or perhaps he did not dream at all. He saw a figure at the top of the stairs, tall and narrow, its face blurred as though hidden behind moving glass. It leaned forward, watching him with a patience that froze the blood in his veins. He told himself it was a dream. He clung to that thought until the scrape at the door returned, louder than before. When he woke, the lamp had burned out. The storm had passed. The silence remained, deeper now, heavier. The trail across the floor had disappeared, yet his footprints were clearly visible along its path, leading to the stairs he swore he never climbed. When the story of the house on the hill was eventually told, it was pieced together not from a single account but from fragments scattered across journals, reports, and the frightened testimonies of neighbors who never wanted their names written down. Each fragment on its own seemed trivial. Scratches on wood, broken locks, faint whispers caught in the walls. But when gathered together, the fragments became something else entirely, a mosaic of unease, each piece pointing to the same conclusion. Solitude in that house was never true. Solitude. The occupant's journal was perhaps the most direct evidence, though its pages were not complete. They began with casual notes, brief records of weather, meals, and moments of reflection. But gradually the tone shifted. Entries grew longer, sentences more frantic, words repeating as though the writer sought reassurance in their own handwriting. Early lines described noises, footsteps upstairs, whispers through walls, taps against the windows late at night. Later entries moved beyond sound into sensation. A constant weight pressed on their chest as they sat alone. Cold drafts swept through sealed rooms. On more than one page, the words "it watches" appeared, written in uneven lines that slanted across the paper as though scrawled in haste. One entry stood out from the rest. It described waking to find objects rearranged on the table, a fork placed neatly across the plate he had left unfinished, a glass positioned at the edge of the counter as though inviting him to reach for it, and the lamp in the corner shifted toward the staircase. The occupant wrote that he had checked the locks, that no windows were broken, yet the changes were undeniable. He admitted he considered leaving, but ended the entry with a chilling sentence: "Wherever I go, it will follow." Investigators who later reviewed the journal dismissed parts of it as the natural unraveling of a mind strained by isolation. Yet even they could not explain the physical evidence inside the house. The scratches on the back door, for instance, cut deep into the wood, uneven and jagged as though carved by something with more persistence than strength. No animal tracks were ever found outside. No tool marks that might suggest human tampering. The marks stretched upward in irregular patterns, some far higher than any hand could comfortably reach. Neighbors contributed their own unsettling accounts. One couple swore they had seen lights flickering in the upstairs window long after the house was supposed to be empty. Another claimed that during a walk past the property, they heard a low hum vibrating through the ground, though no machinery was running and no wires connected to the house. Children, with their brutal honesty, admitted they sometimes saw someone standing behind the curtains, though the figure never moved, never shifted, only stood as though waiting for them to look away. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from a delivery driver who claimed to have knocked on the door one afternoon, delivering a parcel no one had ordered. He swore he heard footsteps inside approaching the threshold, halting just inches away. The driver waited, listening, but no one opened the door. He left the package on the porch. When he glanced back minutes later, the package was gone. No record of its retrieval was ever found, and the driver avoided the road from that day forward. Psychologists who studied the case argued that prolonged solitude could produce hallucinations. They suggested that the occupant's senses had begun to betray him, layering imagined sounds and sights onto the mundane. Isolation, they said, breaks the barrier between reality and fear, especially when paired with an environment already burdened by rumor. But others disagreed. They pointed to the physical details, the scratches, the missing objects, the rearranged furniture, as evidence that something beyond the mind had moved within those walls. One particularly unsettling artifact was recovered during a later inspection. A locked box found beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs room. Inside were small personal belongings, trinkets, photographs, and letters that did not belong to the most recent occupant. The handwriting on the letters was old, ink-faded, paper brittle with age. Yet what disturbed investigators most was the recurring theme within them. Each writer described a sense of not being alone, a presence in the house that seemed to adapt to the person living there. One letter ended with a phrase repeated several times. "It waits when I sleep. It waits when I am awake." No signature followed. Conflicting details deepened the unease. Some neighbors insisted the occupant was seen walking the fields even after reports claimed the house was abandoned. Others swore they heard him speaking to someone late at night, though his voice carried a strained, frantic tone that suggested argument rather than conversation. Yet no second voice was ever heard. Records from the town suggested multiple calls for assistance were made from the property, but the phone lines to the house had been cut long before the occupant arrived. No one could explain who had placed the calls, or how. Theories grew, fueled by these contradictions. Some claimed the house created echoes of its own history, replaying fragments of lives long since ended. Others whispered of an intruder who had learned to hide within its walls, moving silently, living in the shadows. But the evidence never aligned neatly. Every explanation left too many holes, too many unanswered questions, and the most haunting clue remained unsolved. During one inspection, investigators noted prints across the dust in the upstairs hallway. At first glance, they resembled bare feet, elongated slightly as if dragged. But when compared, the prints did not match one another. Each impression varied, as though multiple figures had walked the hall, all leaving behind distorted traces. Yet only one person had ever been recorded living there. The fragments together painted no clear picture. They offered only a puzzle, the edges jagged, the pieces cut from different worlds. The more closely one studied them, the less sense they made, until the only certainty remained the same one the occupant had scrawled in his journal. Being alone in that house was never truly being alone. Loneliness, in most homes, is a passing state. A brief hush before the sound of footsteps or voices fills the silence again. But in that house, loneliness was not temporary. It grew into something alive, wrapping itself around the mind until thoughts no longer belonged to the person who carried them. The occupant, once a man of quiet routine, began to unravel in ways no neighbor could ignore, though none dared to speak of it openly. At first, the changes were subtle. He became withdrawn from the rare errands that took him into town. His eyes no longer met those of the shopkeeper. His words clipped, his face pale as though drained of sleep. He returned to the house quickly, carrying fewer items than before, as if he could not endure the thought of being away for too long. The house had become a tether, one that drew him back even as it hollowed him out. Days stretched into weeks. Sleep abandoned him. When he did manage to drift into shallow dreams, he woke gasping, drenched in sweat. Convinced that someone had been whispering just above his ear, he began moving his furniture at night, pushing chairs against doors, stacking objects in front of windows. Yet each morning he found his defenses altered, chairs dragged aside, stacks toppled neatly instead of in chaos. He no longer trusted his own hands. He wrote in his journal that sometimes he woke to find himself standing in the hallway, staring at the staircase. Though he could not recall walking there, his appearance reflected his decline. Once tall and composed, he became hunched, his skin stretched tight over bone, his hair unkempt and graying faster than time should allow. His eyes, when glimpsed by the few who saw him, carried a frantic shine, darting constantly to corners no one else thought to check. He muttered to himself in public, lips moving in silent argument as though someone invisible walked beside him, goading him with words only he could hear. The townspeople began to avoid the road near the hill. Mothers pulled their children close when passing. Fathers found excuses to take longer routes even if it meant delay. Whispers spread that the occupant no longer belonged entirely to himself. Some swore they saw him standing at his upstairs window long into the night, motionless, his face pale against the dark glass. Others claimed his shadow moved when he did not, a darker outline shifting independently, stretching longer than the frame of his body. Inside the house, his paranoia deepened. He scribbled across pages of his journal, not just words but desperate sketches, figures at the edges of his vision, doorways narrowing as though closing in on him, eyes that multiplied in every reflection. He smashed mirrors, covered windows, and yet still swore he saw movement. He complained of the sound of breathing in rooms where no one stood. He pressed his ear against the walls and said he heard faint knocking, like someone trapped inside trying to signal him. Isolation eroded his trust in the outside world as well. He began to believe that the town was conspiring against him, that their silence meant they knew something he did not. When he caught the glance of a passerby, he interpreted it as accusation. When he overheard laughter, he believed it carried malice. His mind, already burdened by solitude, twisted everything into evidence that he was surrounded not by indifference but by hostility. The psychological weight of fear bled into his body. His hands shook when holding even the simplest object. He developed a habit of pacing endlessly through the halls at night, his footsteps dragging, his muttering echoing through the empty rooms. Neighbors claimed they sometimes heard him shouting in the early hours, though no one dared to approach. One reported hearing two voices, overlapping, one frantic and human, the other low, steady, and unrecognizable. The damage extended beyond him. The community, once dismissive, began to feel the strain of his presence. Stories of his decline spread quickly, feeding the atmosphere of dread that had surrounded the house for years. Children who once played near the property now refused to approach. Dogs howled when led past the gates, straining against their leashes. The road itself grew abandoned, as if silence from within the house had infected the world outside. Yet the deepest fracture was not in the town, but in the man himself. He no longer distinguished between waking and dreaming. He wrote of hearing footsteps behind him, turning and finding nothing only to wake hours later in a different room. Unsure if he had moved or been placed there, he described lying in bed, frozen as pressure weighed against his chest, a presence leaning closer until his vision darkened. He could not decide if it was paralysis of the mind or the deliberate act of something unseen. His paranoia seeped into every moment, every gesture. He boarded up windows, then tore them down. He burned scraps of paper he believed carried hidden messages, only to weep as the ashes scattered. He stopped eating meals entirely some days, convinced the food had been tampered with. He grew thinner, weaker, until even the simplest act required effort. The house, meanwhile, seemed to pulse with his decline. Floorboards groaned more frequently. Doors swung open without cause. Lights flickered in patterns that mocked the rhythm of his breathing. It was as though the structure itself fed on his deterioration, each new crack in his mind giving the walls more strength. His suffering became its sustenance, his unraveling its symphony. And through it all he remained alone. Utterly alone. No visitor stayed long. No neighbor dared to check on him. He existed as a shadow within a shadow, unseen yet deeply felt. The loneliness that had once been his choice had transformed into a prison. And that prison whispered endlessly to him, molding his thoughts, shaping his fears, until his identity dissolved into the echo of the house itself. The tragedy was not just in the fear he carried. It was in how that fear hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a vessel for silence to inhabit. He was no longer simply a man living in an isolated house. He was becoming part of its history, another fragment for future whispers, another figure who would one day stand in the window, waiting for eyes to notice. When the occupant's silence grew too complete, when days turned into weeks without so much as a glimpse of him in town, the whispers reached a peak. Fearful as they were, the townspeople could not entirely ignore the hill. They spoke in half-sentences about who should check, who should knock, who should brave the quiet path that led up to the property. Eventually, an official inquiry was made, not out of curiosity but out of obligation. The authorities arrived with measured steps, flashlights cutting through the stagnant air, their voices lowered as though they, too, feared what might listen from within the walls. What they found, at least in public record, seemed inconclusive. The house showed no signs of forced entry. No footprints led away from the property. Inside, the occupant's belongings remained scattered, his journal still open on the table, pen left on the page as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. Yet he was nowhere to be found. His bed was unmade, a plate still rested on the counter, the lamp stood tilted toward the stairwell. It was as though he had vanished in the middle of a life that had no conclusion. Theories rose quickly to fill the silence his absence left. The official explanation leaned heavily on isolation, exhaustion, and mental collapse. Investigators suggested that the occupant had wandered into the storm and succumbed to the elements. But no body was ever found. Search parties combed the valley, the woods, the rivers, but turned up nothing more than broken branches and muddy trails that led nowhere. It was as though the man had stepped into the storm and been erased by it. Others disagreed. Some investigators noted details that refused to be explained away. The upstairs door, still nailed shut from within, could not be forced open without splintering. Yet the nails themselves were rusted deep into the wood as if they had been in place for decades. Who then had secured the door, and what was meant to stay inside? The floorboards bore fresh scratches too recent to belong to the original construction. And in the dust along the windowsill there were marks, small, deliberate, like fingertips pressed again and again, waiting for someone to notice. Psychological experts argued that the man's journals were proof of a fractured mind. They claimed that solitude had driven him into paranoia, that the whispers, shadows, and rearranged objects were the result of his own hands, carried out in a fugue state he could no longer remember. They cited similar cases of isolation-induced delusion, where the brain, starved of human contact, begins to invent presences simply to fill the void. But even these experts could not dismiss the evidence that did not fit. The journal entries that described details neighbors had reported independently, the phone calls made from a line that had long been cut, the strange footprints in the upstairs dust that did not match the shape of any human foot. Folklorists saw the story differently. They claimed the house carried an imprint, a residue of suffering from those who had lived within its walls before. They pointed to the letters found in the locked box, each describing the same dread, each insisting that being alone there was never true solitude. The repetition across decades suggested a pattern too precise to be coincidence. They argued the house itself had grown into something more than timber and stone, that it held memory the way the earth holds water, bleeding it slowly into anyone who stepped inside. Some theories reached further into the territory few wanted to consider. A handful of townspeople swore that the occupant had been taken, not by weather or madness, but by something that lived inside the house, waiting for each tenant to weaken before claiming them. They pointed to the missing families of years past, to the unfinished letters, to the unmarked graves on the outskirts of the valley. They whispered of a presence older than the town itself, a presence that required witnesses to suffer, to crumble, to become hollow enough to join the silence. The most unnerving accounts came not from officials but from those who avoided writing anything down. A former neighbor confessed after too much drink that he had once looked up at the house during a late-night storm and seen not one figure in the window, but several. They stood side by side, unmoving, their faces obscured by darkness. When lightning flashed, he swore he saw their mouths open, though no sound reached him. He never walked that road again. And still the investigations ended with no answer. Reports were filed, boxes were sealed, and the case of the missing occupant was closed with the simple phrase, "presumed deceased." But among the people who lived nearby, the story never ended. It lived in their habits, their silences, their careful avoidance of the hill. Each time the wind carried the sound of creaking wood from afar, each time a child claimed to see a shadow in the window, the story grew stronger, heavier. Even outsiders, drawn by curiosity, found themselves unsettled. A group of travelers once dared to camp near the property, mocking the warnings of the townspeople. They left before sunrise, refusing to explain why. One of them later admitted in a shaken voice that he had woken to the sound of breathing not his own. He opened his eyes to find the canvas of his tent pressed inward by the shape of a hand. The impression lingered until dawn. Theories will always multiply in the absence of answers. Some argue for rational explanations, others embrace the supernatural, and still others claim that truth cannot be separated from belief. But in this case, the lack of resolution was not merely an inconvenience. It was a wound, left open for anyone who dared to look. Each theory only deepened the unease, for none could close the gap. None could explain how a man could vanish without a trace in a house where silence itself seemed to breathe. And so the story endures, carried not in official records but in lowered voices, in wary glances toward the hill, in the lingering question that no investigation ever solved. Was he ever truly alone? Or was something waiting for him from the very beginning? There are stories that fade with time, softened into myths until they no longer hold weight. But there are others that refuse to loosen their grip. Stories that linger not because of what they reveal, but because of what they never explain. The house on the hill belongs to the second kind. Its silence continues to press against the valley. Its windows still dark, its doors still closed, and yet no one truly believes it is empty. What unsettles most is not the memory of the occupant, though his disappearance left a shadow that stretched far beyond the walls. It is the possibility that his fate was only one chapter in a cycle that will not end. He was not the first to hear the knocks, to feel the drafts, to write desperate lines across pages that offered no protection. He was not the first to stand in the window, frozen pale as unseen eyes watched him. And he was not the first to vanish, leaving nothing behind but fragments of fear. The house has consumed others, in ways quiet enough to escape headlines but sharp enough to cut into the memory of a town. Letters left unfinished, meals half-eaten, families gone without explanation. The evidence never forms a complete picture, yet it is always the same. Solitude warped into something unbearable, silence that became too heavy, the overwhelming sense that to live within those walls was to invite something closer. Theories offer no comfort. To believe the man simply wandered into the storm is to ignore the evidence left behind. To believe he succumbed to madness is to disregard the matching accounts of strangers across decades. To believe something supernatural claimed him is to accept that the house itself is not structure, but predator, one that feeds not on bodies, but on the gradual unraveling of the mind. And perhaps that is the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that something came for him, but that the house itself was enough. The town avoids the subject now. Questions about the house are met with silence, with eyes that look away, with lips pressed shut. Outsiders who ask are given vague answers, warnings disguised as casual advice. Do not go up there, some will say. It is nothing to see. But in their voices lies a tremor that betrays what they refuse to name. They do not fear what might happen inside the house. They fear that once you enter, part of you never leaves. And still, the stories continue to surface. Someone walking past at dusk will swear they saw a flicker of light in an upstairs room. A hunter crossing the valley will describe hearing footsteps trailing him, though no one followed. A traveler driving at night will look to the hill and see a figure standing in the window, still as glass, watching the road below. When asked later what the figure looked like, their voice will lower, and they will confess that it resembled someone they knew, someone long gone. The question lingers like a wound that will not close. What does the house want? Why does it wait through years of emptiness only to draw in one soul at a time? Some believe it thrives on fear, that it requires its occupants to break slowly, piece by piece, until the mind collapses into something it can claim. Others suggest it reflects what people carry into it, turning solitude into a mirror that shows not what is real, but what is most feared. But those who have listened closely, who have read the fragments of journals, letters, and testimonies, know that the truth may be worse. The house does not wait for fear. It creates it, sustains it, and in the end, it replaces the person entirely. Imagine standing in that living room, the rain pressing against the glass, the lamp flickering, the silence breathing heavy against your skin. Imagine knowing you are alone, and yet hearing the steady scrape at the door, the faint knock from upstairs, the sound of someone shifting just beyond sight. You tell yourself you are safe, that you are imagining it. You remind yourself that solitude is silence. But what if silence has been lying all along? What if being alone is nothing more than the first step toward discovery? That something has always been there, waiting for the moment you realize you are not truly by yourself. That is why the story haunts, not because of what is known, but because of what will never be explained. The house stands still, watching, its history written in unfinished letters, in vanished footprints, in windows that reflect more than they reveal. It will remain, waiting for the next soul who believes solitude is harmless, for the next person who trusts silence to keep them safe. And when that moment comes, the story will begin again. Another life dissolving into fragments. Another presence added to the figures in the window. Perhaps the most terrifying question is not what happened to the man who disappeared. It is whether the house itself remembers him. If one night you pass by and glance toward the hill, if you see a figure standing behind the curtain, how certain will you be that it is not his face looking back? How certain can you be that it is not waiting for you to notice? The story ends, but the silence does not.